There we go. So welcome to our fourth MarSocSci webinar. As many of you will know, the Marine Social Science Network has been set up as a community for bringing together marine social scientists, but also those working in or interested in marine social sciences outside of academia in an interdisciplinary way. So a real kind of breadth and mixture of different fields of research, and we're really trying to showcase those through the Marine Social Science webinar series. We've had a range of topics covered already. So we had marine protected areas and coastal community engagement in our first one. We had blue growth from Patrick Heidkamp, and also climate change adaptation in coastal communities from Glenn Smith last month. So a real mix of topics. Today we are welcoming researchers from the One Ocean Hub, and they're going to speak about the work that they've been doing in South Africa. So we have Dylan, Kira and Anna. They are going to introduce themselves. So I'm going to hand over to Dylan now in a second. But as I said, please keep your questions coming in through the Q&A box during the session. They'll share their screens to do the presentation, but we'll coordinate the questions at the end and I'll pose them to the speakers once the presentation's finished. So I will switch off my video now and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves and start your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. And thank you. It's so wonderful to be in this, have an opportunity to be in this network and have a chance to share some of our work. So we're really grateful. I'm Dylan McGarry and I'm at the Environmental Learning Research Centre at the university currently known as Rhodes in South Africa. And I'm a co-director of the One Ocean Hub. And I'm really interested in creative practice and participation in collaborative co-designed research for environmental justice. And then I have these amazing two colleagues who are great friends and amazing comrades. But Kira, do you want to just say something about yourself?
Yes, thanks, Dylan. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. My name is Kira Erwin. I'm based in the city of Durban at the Urban Futures Centre in the Durban University of Technology. I am a sociologist, but a lot of my work looks at how constructs of difference work, usually in city spaces, but increasingly around environmental justice issues. And I'm very interested in how forms of public storytelling might not only become research methodologies, but ways in which we start to shift narratives around power in various sectors. So lovely to be here today. Anna.
Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for having us. My name is Anna James. I am with Dylan at the Environmental Learning Research Centre at the university currently known as Rhodes. I am doing a PhD which tries to look into the socio-ecological justice education, linking kind of pedagogies and social movement. And yeah, look forward to this session. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So today I'm just going to pull up my PowerPoint, but now where did it go? One second. So yeah, I'm just going to share a little bit about what is the One Ocean Hub, just so you can get a sense of what's brought us together on this work. Let me just make a full screen. Can you see that? Anna, is that good? Kira?
Yeah, okay, we can see it, yeah, thanks.
Yes.
Great. So, I mean, we're going to focus mainly around a project we've developed out of the One Ocean Hub called Lalela Ulwandle, which has formed part of our Empatheatre work, which happened before the Ocean Hub, where we were working as sociologists and artists around this kind of, public storytelling methodology. But we'll get into that in a bit. So really, the One Ocean Hub has been a way for us to deepen and expand the Empatheatre methodology. And the goal of the One Ocean Hub is really to bring together try to look at transformative governance of the ocean space in 5 countries: South Africa, Ghana, Namibia, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands. And, we've noticed, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with the many disconnects around ocean decision-making. And of particular concern for the One Ocean Hub is the many ways in which many different groups of people don't have access to the decision-making spaces or their knowledge systems or their particular worldviews, experiences, concerns and day-to-day lives aren't being fully connected into the ocean decision-making space. And so what the One Ocean Hub is quite an ambitious collaboration of lawyers, marine scientists, marine sociologists, artists, anthropologists, and a bunch of people in between, as well as project partners. There's over 180 different researchers in the network across the 5 regions, including also the UK. And we have over 30, I think it's over 30 other project partners, both international NGOs, local NGOs, even some government parastatals, and 3 UN departments that have kind of come in to participate in this project. It's funded by the Global Challenge Research Fund and the UKRI. And it's a research for development project. So it's very interested in focusing on research that can support transformative approaches to development and support the SDGs. Within that, though, we've been able to get a lot of freedom, quite radical freedom, around exploring alternative methodologies and looking at creative practice. So we're really going to focus on that in this seminar. And yeah, I'm going to let Kira take us on a bit of a journey on the process about how we developed this particular project, Lalela Ulwandle, as an example of some of the work we've been doing.
Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, so I'm going to talk through how we came to run the first project within the One Ocean Hub called Lalela Ulwandle, which in isiZulu, which is one of the largest language groups in South Africa, and especially in the province where I am, KwaZulu-Natal, means listen to the ocean. And it was inspired actually by a meeting that I attended 2 years ago now, which is quite interesting. And what had happened is an environmental justice organization that I've done work with previously had called together representatives, almost 100 people from small towns along the KZN coastline. An application to drill for oil and gas had just been put through, and our state entity that decides whether applications are successful or not, PASA, was coming to meet the community representatives. And it was an area that I didn't have much expertise in, but I'd been asked to facilitate the meeting. And the thing that struck me the most was the sort of inability of PASA, the petroleum agency representatives, especially the lawyers on that panel, to listen to the very different voices that were coming out in that large meeting. And what had happened is that they said that you had a company on the one hand, on the other hand, you had something called community, in which they were imagining some sort of homogenous entity, and then they just had to make a decision between whether to give the company the right or whether to say, no, the community have valid concerns. But increasingly, I think this is problematic because in South Africa, we have such diverse communities and people were opposed to the oil and gas drilling for very, very different reasons. So Dylan, could we have the next slide, please? So what we did, and it's been incredible to work with Dylan and his team, is to say, well, we need to listen more carefully. What are people's concerns? How do they differ? How are they the same? What are the issues that people are raising? And perhaps more importantly, what kind of meaning are people living on the KwaZulu-Natal coast have of the oceans? What is a symbolic meaning, spiritual meaning, of course, livelihood meaning, as well as leisure and pleasure? And we did interviews and focus groups with Marine Shark and Marine World, which is our aquarium here in Durban, with the educators, as well as with subsistence fishers. And there are many of those up and down the coast where I live. And if we go to the next slide, we spent time in different areas on the beach. We spoke to experts, we spoke to policymakers. We had long meetings with environmental justice organizations who were working to oppose oil and gas drilling of different kinds. And importantly, we also did more oral history research with lifeguards on our beaches, with traditional healers in South Africa, well, especially where I'm from, it's called sangomas, and with storytellers, because there are many beautiful myths and legends about our oceans along this coastline. So what this methodology does is it starts with narrative inquiry and then takes the narrative data and starts to write it into a form of script, a piece of theatre script to be played back. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that the narrative data gets woven in a very collaborative way into a theatre script. Once we have a draft script, we take it back and do table readings, often with key partners that were part of the project from the beginning or who have been participants and actually told their story. So sorry, Dill, to the next slide. I'm moving quite fast through this. Dill, thanks, yeah. So this is a process, and if you've got questions around this, we'd love to answer them. And certainly this is something that Dylan can focus on more, is this idea of iterative storytelling. So to listen, to collect narrative data, to take that narrative data, to play it back or to read it back to participants or other stakeholders, and to start a discussion about what these stories mean. So the script goes through a number of iterants until it finally gets performed. And that often includes sort of fact checking or saying to people, did we get your story right? Did we hear you correctly? Is this how you think what you're trying to say around ocean and meaning has to be positioned? And then Dill, I'm going to ask you to go 2 slides forward, please. So it's just some of the table readings, reading it back to people. And when and this of course we need a team to do, and we have incredible theatre practitioners, Neil Coppin and Mpumi Mtubeni. You can see her holding the shell there. She's also a performer, who help us sort of weave the story into this incredible piece of theatre. And in Lalela Ulwandle, what we wanted to sort of encapsulate is that there are many different ways in which the ocean is experienced. There are different ways in which the ocean is made sense of, and there are very deep meanings which people attach to those, both through sort of memories and symbols, but also through spiritual beliefs. And we have 3 characters: Naren, who his ancestry has come from indentured labor from India to South Africa, long cultural heritage of different types of fishing. We have Faye, who's a retired marine scientist, and then Ulwandle. And Ulwandle is an educator in the aquarium, but her mother is a Zionist, which is a type of mixture between Christianity and traditional religion in South Africa. And her grandmother is a Sangoma, who practices types of healing with the sea. What weaves these characters together is the very same thing that we asked all the participants during the research process. So both the focus groups as well as those oral history narratives start with asking people, what is your first memory of the sea? And so these kind of emotive stories that how humans relate to the ocean is what draws the 3 stories together. The 3 characters have also all attended that PASA meeting that I spoke about 2 years ago. And next slide, please, Dill. So you might be interested too to see how the research script actually starts to form a type of research report or policy brief. It's footnoted often with further explanations or links to academic resources or policy briefs. And so we use this as a way to actually start doing our analysis from quite early on. Sorry, next slide, though. Okay, we're going to try and play the trailer. I'm hoping the sound comes through, but maybe Anna or Emma, if there is an issue with the sound, you can just give us a heads up, just so you get a sense of what it's like to listen to some of these stories in the theatre production.
Back in the day, it was said there were more fish in the sea than there were grains of sand on the Durban beaches.
The communities that make up this coastline are not just a single group or a single voice.
Without you even knowing, your breathing is moving in time with the waves and everything just melts away.
It was fantastic. The whole idea of the theatre and around, the whole idea of Empatheatre takes stories into a new medium.
My mother had once told me how Moses had parted the waves to let his people through. I was secretly hoping the sea would do the same thing for me. It's done, it's raining. Please can we go home?
You remember what he used to say? No, Kana. What he used to say? What the sea giveth, the sea taketh away.
Now these companies are planning to send in machines with big teeth into the bottom of the sea.
And what's the bloody point of me sitting here with my measly rod when everything's been taken already?
We are talking imminent collapse of whole ecosystems.
These companies have bribed the chief to keep the truth from us. They had known all along. The mining trucks were already lined up along our beaches.
The sea remembers, my boy. It doesn't keep secrets, and in the end it throws everything back at us.
I thought it was brilliant. I think more people should come to this play. I'm glad they're taking it up and down the coast. Towards the end, I was almost in tears.
I only care so deeply about the ocean because I've had the privilege of seeing what lies beneath.
You know what I always tell the children? This heaven they all want a one-way ticket to. It's not in the direction those missionaries promised us it was, no. It's in the opposite direction. It's down there, beneath the waves.
Thanks, Dylan. So that just gives you a taste of what it's like to experience types of research narrative when they performed rather than read in reports or academic articles. And what really this methodology does is it's an invitation to a conversation. So I will hand over in a minute to Dylan to explain how the second layer of data collection works around this facilitated conversation. But perhaps just to point to three sort of key themes that we thought was really important. One is just how useful it is if we are going to make sort of wise and responsive decision-making around our oceans, to remember the different ways in which it is imagined and used. And that amongst this complexity, using pathos and humor can be a very productive way to start a conversation rather than from sort of polarized camps in which you can only argue from one point of view. Next slide, please, Dill. And I think one of the things that was really interesting is just how deep the intergenerational knowledge is around the sea for some people along our coast, but also a sense that some of this knowledge is starting to get lost, and what one might do to ensure that it isn't. And then just the last slide from me, and actually one more. So I'm sure most of you know about apartheid's forced removals, but this was a very important element that came through the research, and actually an important element in the conversations with audiences afterwards, is that given our history of colonialism and apartheid, being removed from the coast for many Black people in South Africa, that history is still very painful and very real. And people's mothers and grandmothers, they have memories of this. So the conservation efforts that are happening around marine protected areas, for example, are frequently experienced in a very similar way as what was happening under apartheid, even though they have a different intent. And these are some of the sort of difficult questions that we have to start to ask ourselves. How do we talk about this pain? How do we make decisions differently? How do we make them in ways that are inclusive? And then lastly, I think certainly what I found just fascinating about this whole process is how do you create an audience with ears, an audience that's willing to listen to a chorus of different voices around ocean governance? you know, where you can recognize that science, spirituality, economic livelihoods, indigenous knowledge, whilst they might to some extent be sort of separate traditions or knowledge systems, you know, you can find a kind of translation protocol across them and between them, so that we have a sense of a shared humanity in resisting threats to our ocean. Thanks very much. I'm going to hand over to Dylan, and he's going to take you through the next steps.
Thanks, Kira. No, that's great. Yeah, so from there, you've got a kind of picture of how it was. Can you all hear me and see me okay? I'm not sure if you can, but I hope you can.
Yes, we can.
Myself. Okay, cool. Yeah, so from once we've created the piece and we start touring it, I just wanted to just show how that aspect is also a continuation of the iterative research, but something that we get into now, which is where kind of we're seeing, especially in our community, as sociologists and educational sociologists, as our role in kind of transgressive learning, and also kind of shifting from not just academic rigor, but political rigor. And what is our work in kind of interventionist research or research for development, or in some cases, scholar activism. So this is just an example of one of the tours we did. These are the different shows where we performed. And each one can be seen as a kind of tribunal or testimonial space. So what we discovered in previous Empatheatre projects was dealing with other issues. It's just this incredible, powerful space for almost extra legal conversations around disputes or conflict, but also a very powerful space for healing and kind of testimonies. I mean, we had the very powerful legacy of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And although this is at nowhere near at that scale, or even trying to even do the kind of work that did, there is something very powerful, as Kira said, about creating an audience with ears and creating this deep empathetic space for listening and holding difference. And it's why we call the methodology Empatheatre. It's literally trying to create an amphitheater for empathy. So this was some of the performances we did last year, prior to the lockdown, and we did some more here in the Eastern Cape. We started traveling down the coastline, and we were getting lots of feedback, both from the conversations in the post-show discussions, but also there were feedback forms, and from that were new data and new stories, and it became quite prolific. So this is our team, both the actors and the researchers, all sitting down together straight away after a show, which we did every show, and try to capture all what was emerging in that very powerful circle. And from these, we were able to, okay, let me just show you some of the reflections from the audiences. This is one we did at the aquarium. This was a chance to kind of, although we had shared back the script to these participants who'd been involved in the research, this was a chance for them to actually watch the play while they were at work, at their workplace. And there were lots of discussions around this really interesting dynamic between the very nuanced and the difference people are carrying in their relationship to the sea as individuals. Many of these young marine scientists grew up with very traditional childhoods, and their relationship to the sea was very driven by mythology and kind of other ways of knowing and being. And then they kind of brought into this space of the marine science space of the aquarium. And the way in which those differences were dealt with by the educators was very different to the kind of expected differences we're noticing and seeing in, for say, the kind of conflicts between marine science and social science. It was being able to hold difference and plurality in a completely unique way. We had very emotive reflections after each show, people really realizing that they'd kind of maybe perhaps pathologizing a whole group of people around how they interact with the sea. So there was instances where people didn't really fully understand the Zionist rituals that happen at the beach. And if you look at the coastal space in South Africa, it's one of the most integrated and culturally diverse spaces. You could be walking along the beach, and one moment you're seeing a traditional Zionist ritual happening. You can see a Sangoma offerings to the sea. At the same time, there's young surfers and small-scale fishers, people with metal detectors collecting things, all sharing this very common space, but all have very different meaning to it. And that really came out. So Kira's spoken to some of this already. We also had very interesting kind of discussions and debates where we would just sit back, and almost the play and the space had created its own facilitator force, where we no longer had to kind of we could just sit there as responsible participants in this tribunal. And there were interesting discussions around some people saying, oh, this is sacred knowledge, it shouldn't be shared, even though we'd been given permission by the healers that we spoke to share this knowledge. Others would stand up and say, no, our children need to hear this. And it really opened up really interesting public debate in own vernacular language, in this case in isiZulu, around, you know, various aspects of people's relationships to the sea. There was a lot of reflection, which we were very surprised by, or that the ocean space allowed us a lot of discussion around race and class in our country, which is often very hard to talk about, whereas this allowed us to talk about it with an openness. And we find also in the Empatheatre methodology the power of storytelling and theatre and connective aesthetics. So the objects themselves, the props, the stories that now sit in the circle, but also the actors themselves act as proxies. So instead of people finger pointing to each other, you said this and you said that, they can point to the stories or point to the actors or point to the scenarios. And in a way, it's kind of a shared, you know, traditional modeling practice in a way, or scenario. What it allowed conversations, I don't think we would have had. So this brought us kind of to a point where we had to think strategically as One Ocean Hub researchers in collaboration with civil society and local leaders who we had built very strong relationships and built on existing relationships we had had going into this, on what do we do while we're touring this project. And this is Taryn Pereira, a researcher also in our team, who's been kind of leading the setting up of this coastal justice network. She's worked in the civil society space for the last 10 years and has really been thinking about what, and trying to ask the questions, how can us as sociologists, how can our research be useful to civil society, to community leaders, to traditional healers? And so this has been a very exciting way in which we had a situation where we had the oil and gas plans, and we were able to take the testimonies with the consent of the participants from the tour and from the shows, and actually create appeals and publish appeals and help people write appeals based on what came out of these public tribunals. So in a way, we were having these kind of adding to the huge failure, or at least I would say the huge inadequacies on the public consultation process that currently exists around marine spatial planning, around EIAs, around integrated management plans. They are, and also with the marine protected areas expansion in the country, there's a kind of common denominator and a common agreement amongst marine sociologists in our country that the consultation process is not enough. And this has become our strategic focus as the One Ocean Hub, is how can we research what obstacles exist for participation, and what can we do to help facilitate that. So, building a solidarity network is kind of one of our core tasks as researchers, and using this methodology. It also allowed us to kind of rethink our role as scholar activists, and also with COVID hitting, we started seeing huge injustices to small-scale fishers in particular, who were being treated unfairly by various kind of decisions that weren't even policies yet. And there was this big discrepancy between how people in the agriculture sector were able to work as essential services, but not the fishers, the small-scale fishers. And so there was an opportunities for us to help support and facilitate that dialogue, and to take an openness from the GCRF to take all our travel budget and turn it into data and to online access for all the fisher leaders. And we were able to start building this network to also respond to other COVID-related community action needs. before COVID hit, we had a plan. We got this term from a colleague of Kira's, Dylan, who talks about the idea of political acupuncture. And we thought we had noticed the power previously in other projects in Empatheatre in kind of facilitating dialogue space across diverse audiences. And the idea of also strategically inviting diverse audiences. So constructing the audiences with an intended result. So we're starting to see also our plays as kind of elaborate focus groups where you have this double stimulation where we are mirroring back data in the play. But what we're also getting is another opportunity for a deeper engagement and a more rigorous engagement into what does that mean? What does it mean for day-to-day decisions in a local municipality to what it means at international policy space. So we've been exploring these two spaces, and with the help with the Ocean Hub and some of the lawyers who've been working in international policy law, we got access to, we were going to perform at the UN Ocean Conference and IUCN Ocean Congress, have a week-long performance for public, but then also for particular groups in the policymakers. In previous projects, we've been able to, on other projects, been able to also like perform Empatheatre to Parliament in South Africa and facilitate a discussion, and then our script being a policy brief. So yeah, this was our plan, and then that was all changed. And we actually used that as an opportunity to regroup and rethink as our team of researchers and actors and writers. And we decided to create a radio play, and we really encourage you to listen. You can listen to the full Empatheatre play on our website, empatheatre.com, and then you just click on Lalela Ulwandle. And we were able to also perform this at the UN World Oceans Day, or at least speak about this work. We didn't actually get to perform the play, but we got to speak about the work, and we in line to developing a new political acupuncture strategy for next year, where we've got a shoe-in into the working group for the Marine Spatial Planning technical working group for our country as the Ocean Hub, and then also some of these other events like the South African Marine Sciences Conference, amongst others. So we really encourage you to listen to this play, and you can kind of get a sense of what at least the Lalela story is, and what these three character story is. So I'm going to come to Anna now. We'll have a chance at the end to also share some more resources if you're more curious. I'm aware we didn't go that in depth into the actual Empatheatre methodology, and we have some stuff to show you on that. But I wanted to just speak to this opportunity that arose through Lalela and through Empatheatre, where Anna kind of led us in building a workshop, and just before COVID, before it all happened, to really think about what is creative practice and engagement, participatory and transdisciplinary research. So I thought Anna could just share some of these insights from that. So Anna, are you there?
Thank you. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, wow. Thanks, Dylan and Taryn, and sorry, Dylan and Kira. It's been an amazing journey so far. So, as Dylan said, and as you would have heard from Kira and Dylan's sections before me, that a layer of this work has really been about trying to understand the ways in which we can mobilize research to be in kind of solidarity with broader movements for deep and just change, especially in the ocean space. And so I'm going to share a little bit about, I guess it was a moment of pause and reflection in the journey of Lalela Ulwandle, and maybe also a bit of a zooming out to try and think about what it is that is being done in this very exciting kind of methodology that's being sort of developed in response to context, and kind of bringing together a whole lot of exciting tools such as sociological research, but also arts-based work, specifically theatre and storytelling, and then also, of course, public engagements. So I'm just going to share some short things about, some short ways of thinking about what it is we're doing, which I hope are going to resonate in part with the work of the Marine Social Science network. And so maybe, you know, if I go back to the kind of this picture of this bowl here, the sort of focus is, I guess, you know, research that is in solidarity with the world. And you would have heard Dylan mention scholar activism, you know, thinking about how we can, you know, really mobilize our positions as researchers to be more responsive to what is needed in the world. And there's these kind of 3 pillars that we're sort of thinking about. So the one is transdisciplinarity, or potentially disciplinarity more generally, creativity and participation. And so I'm just going to briefly go into these and just share some ways of thinking about them. So as you would know, I imagine as sort of marine social scientists, you know, recently the sort of knowledge production world has been speaking about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and then even some young researchers at the Stockholm Institute are talking about undisciplinarity. But, you know, we're in South Africa, we have quite strong decolonial critiques around what the disciplines do in terms of kind of carving up reality and almost diminishing our capacities to really respond to the fullness of like challenges in the context. And it becomes reductionist. And Leslie Green, an environmental humanities scholar at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, has asked that we have an ocean scholarship regime shift, one that can really try to break down the divides in disciplines. And then at the same time, I know that in practice, interdisciplinary transdisciplinarity is tough because we're all working under a lot of pressure. There in South Africa, we're working with very old kind of almost oppositions between sociological ocean researchers and natural science, marine science ocean researchers, and so it's tough in practice. So I just if you could go to the next slide, Dylan, I'll share just a way in which we can start to sort of think, you know, as we kind of get lost in the swirl of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. This is kind of how we're thinking about it. So the Hader et al., this group of researchers at the Stockholm Institute, present this kind of heuristic or like a compass to try to position ourselves as we sort of try to come together more as researchers. And so on the y-axis is epistemic agility. So this is the idea that we can move less rigidly across different ways of knowing, so we can understand that the experience of a conservation area, the social experience of a conservation area, might be different from what a marine scientist sees as the benefits of it. Then the other one is methodological groundedness. So in a sense, we still have to be well practiced and masterful of a particular method. And I think in the context of Lalela Ulwandle, you'll see that it was a combination of ethnographic research, sociological research, oral history research, but then also this kind of movement between knowledge production and representation in the theatre space, and then, you know, feeding back that information to people who were involved in making it, and then redoing the script and things like that. So in a sense, with Lalela Ulwandle, there's this method that's forming. It's not just simply putting together a play and performing it. There's a sort of method, and we all know that all kind of different kinds of scientists will have particular methods that bring important knowledge to problems. And then we added this kind of extra little axis called contextual responsiveness. And I think, especially working in South Africa, we feel it's often that universities, the role that universities have enacted in the global South and in South Africa and Africa has been one that has been quite potentially violent and reproducing of our social and economic inequalities that we experience. And so this real need to continually go back to the context of what we're researching. So this need to kind of, you know, perform Lalela Ulwandle at a number of different villages along the coast and you know, get feedback from audiences about what resonates and what doesn't. And yeah, so I think that's maybe just one little thing. So as we think about what it means to bring different disciplines together, how can we also organize ourselves in terms of what we're offering in terms of those different dimensions? Thanks, Dylan. If you could go to the next slide. And then we also thought a little bit about the spectrum of participation. And I imagine, you know, as social scientists, the word participation is a fraught one. But at some point, as we try to work across policy, different researchers and things like that, we kind of, you know, we're stuck with this word, and we need to try to work with it as best as we can. And we sort of thought about a bit of a spectrum. So on the far left of the spectrum is this kind of informing and consulting, where, you know, maybe a research is done decisions and recommendations get made, and then communities are told about it, and that's kind of, you know, the most sort of the least form of participation. And in the time of COVID-19, there's a new kind of rendition of this, which is some ocean mining developers deciding that their participation can take the form of a webinar, which in South Africa is wholly inadequate because many coastal communities live without access to data. If they have access to data, they don't have enough signal to be in a Zoom room. We can dive into, you know, even just coming into a room with policymakers and technical speak and often English can be an alienating experience. Coming into a Zoom room where someone is presenting, you know, is a whole nother experience in that. Anyway, so that's just kind of something that we're adding to our, as we work in the Coastal Justice Network, we've been doing a lot of like trying to understand that where these things are happening and alert people to them and try to disrupt them, where, you know, a webinar is kind of taken as an adequate decision-making process. And I think maybe we get back to the kind of participation really is something that's meaningful in terms of how decisions get made along our coast. And I think in the middle, we get, you know, participation as real forms of partnerships. And I think that in the context of the development of Lalela Ulwandle, there's this involvement of people living next to the ocean in the construction of questions, the construction of the stories, and then in the kind of evaluation and the post-performance dialogue. And I think that, you know, a lot of the decisions, the ways in which decision making gets made, it's researchers produce some sort of information, decision makers make the kinds of conclusions, and then and the important practice-based on the ground community knowledge is not taken into account. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, there is a kind of participatory action research that goes too far. So often we find that the focus on communities, especially the researcher focus on communities, marginalized communities, sometimes is actually not what is needed. We often the obstacles and the barriers to the flourishing of communities lies somewhere else, for example, in a government department, in the private sector, something like that. And we discussed at this workshop at length about how we need a whole team of researchers to be actually doing an ethnography of a government department instead of an ethnography of a community who has maybe been researched, you know, too many times in the past. So this is kind of our spectrum of participation. And then I just briefly to say about the third leg of creativity. I think that you've heard a lot in what has been said, the power of using creative. So maybe one thing that needs to be said is arts-based forms and creativity are not kind of the silver bullets in themselves. They don't necessarily do anything in themselves, but positioned with careful political rigor in this way, then they can kind of do quite important things. And I think the reason why we are all holding on to creativity and creative process a lot is because I think in processes of change and processes of social change, we need processes of critique, but we also need processes of creation. You know, we want to move the social sciences from being just a kind of a body of people who build critique about the world, and also figure out how do we create the world that we want. And so maybe that's the last thing I'll say on creativity. And then to get down to the kind of real thanks so much, Bill, to get down to, I think, what I've called the very political, practical considerations. These are some of the things we discussed in our, I should have mentioned that in our reflective workshop, we brought together researchers, but also people from civil society. We were joined by a group of small-scale fishers from an area nearby. And so it was, you know, in the room, we had a transdisciplinary collective, in a sense. We had some, you know, researchers, we had educators, we had communities who fish, who have whole intergenerational knowledge about the coastline. And we realized that, you know, in order to hold this space, there were a lot of important considerations which, you know, were not only important for us, but, you know, helped us to really understand the ways in which there are absences and inadequacies in the decision-making consultation space that Dylan and Kira have kind of alluded to, where, you know, yeah, so I think, you know, we in South Africa, we lived in a terrible reproductive racial capitalism, where spatial segregation historically, but also contemporarily, haunt us and basically keep in place this intense, I think, one of the world's highest inequalities. And it means we exist very separately, and we have very different abilities to travel and move. And so in our planning for this workshop, a huge amount of care had to go into making sure that we were not only there with people who were privileged enough to pay for their own travel, but that we could bring people who couldn't necessarily afford to travel, or who also lived in places where they didn't have good access to public transport to come to where we were in Makanda. And then also, what does it mean to be holding a workshop at a university, and then as someone who spends their time in a rural space on a fishing boat, comes in and has to sort of find their voice where potentially the researchers have very sort of strong voice. And so thinking very carefully about how we hold a space for everyone to have an equal voice. And then language is a highly important thing, I'm sure, around the world as well. But in South Africa, we have 11 official languages, and yet still a huge hegemonic way of using English. We experimented a little bit with not only providing translation so that everybody could have access to the conversation, but also thinking about the possibilities that the diversity of language, and we had 14 different languages in the room with us. So the diversity of meaning making that language brings. So in the beginning of the session, we just invited everyone as they introduced themselves to translate the word participation into their language. And with each translation, there was a nuance that came with this word. I mean, sometimes when we just speak English, we assume that there is one meaning to a word, rather than a word being something that, gets kind of meaning that gets culturally produced. And for example, one participant gave forward the word, the Sesotho word letsema, which means quite literally to prepare the soil. And it was quite a lovely way to think about the idea of participation, because it's not just a move to include people, but what we really want to do is prepare the soil and prepare the space for everyone to be meaningfully included. I don't even want to use the word included, but meaningfully participating. And then, finally, building relationships, getting our power analysis going as we build creative representations of the work and the knowledge building we're doing. How can we also be positioning ourselves as kind of opposed to the structures that are continually holding us in this unequal kind of social relationship? And I just want to end with one of the fishers who watched the play with us. He said, I love this play, and it really gets our stories, very well, and it shares all our struggles. But he said, we know the story. I want to understand, where is the enemy? And so it was just this very beautiful reminder, and he participated in our kind of methodological discussion, really, a reminder that we also need to start, understanding where, who, how, what, why is the enemy there that is kind of obstructing us from realizing better change in our societies. And so I'm going to pause there. I hope that was something that could be useful to everyone here. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Anna. Just to say also, I've got the wrong picture here, and this is actually from another project that Kira led on migrant women in Durban, South Africa, another Empatheatre project called The Last Country. I've somehow put the wrong picture in from the wrong workshop, sorry. I just to say just quickly on some resources, just to go deeper into that just for a moment, we developed this concept of political rigor further from Boras when he first coined the phrase with people from the academic activists for the co-production of knowledge for environmental justice, Leah Temper and Lena Weber. And we've kind of identified in this paper, it's a literature review, but also interviews with other scholar activists around different types of research. And we kind of make them into tarot cards and kind of unpack what are the different aspects of doing research in this way, and kind of the ethical questions we need to ask ourselves, and the kind of rigor we need to perfect in a way, or refine. So you can find this paper, it's a shameless plug, but it's connected to this work we've been thinking about in participation in research. And then finally, also, if there's anything, I know we're kind of running out of over time, but if there's anything more you want to know, please go to our Empatheatre website. You can listen to the play, and you can also see some of our other projects that deal with street level drug addiction, that have dealt with migrant, the experiences of migrant women, that have dealt with gentrification and housing, and now ocean governance. And we've also looked at displacement from mining. And then we also have a video that kind of outlines, it's a short documentary that just explains the methodology in a bit more detail of what is Empatheatre, because we really chose to focus on the Lalela, the ocean project, in this seminar. So I'll leave it there, and if there is time, I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Sorry, it's not a lot of time, sorry.
That was great. Thank you all so much. I utterly enjoyed, that was just fascinating to listen to. I have so many questions and so many things I'd love to talk about. Although some things, as I was writing them down, you were answering them as you were going, which was brilliant. But I do think there's so much that needs to be said around, you know, how we use so much of the work that you've been doing and the themes you've brought up to ensure that we're moving towards a much more inclusive and just and equitable way of thinking about our ocean and coastal spaces. And I think this really plays into a lot of conversations that I think many of us are having at the moment, particularly as we're looking towards the UN Ocean Decade and those sorts of opportunities. And I really found the adaptation in response to COVID fascinating, because I think a lot of us are kind of experiencing that. And I think the points that you all raised around you know, that actually moving online in some ways has been great, and it's really increased access for some people, but actually has isolated others and made it so that other people can't engage. And I think that those topics around cultural context, when you're developing workshops, I mean, I've had conversations here in the UK about how we engage with fishers and fishing communities, and people say, well, what if they don't come to the workshop? And we're like, well, then you go to them, you go to their boat, you go to the harbour side and you speak to them where they're comfortable. You know, that's what you've got to do to make sure that they can be involved and participate in a meaningful way. So there was some brilliant themes. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed the session. We've not had any questions, I don't think, come up through the Q&A box. If anybody does have any questions, please feel free. I know people might have to head off, but if you do have any questions that you'd like to pose to any of the speakers, I can put you in touch with them. That's no problem. I had a question around how this sort of conversation and evidence is being received from a policy and governance perspective in South Africa. So I know you mentioned that you were going to present and that one of the audiences would be those policymakers, but one of the challenges we have here in the UK is how we embed and use that social and cultural and more qualitative evidence within decision making, because the process is still designed in such a way that tick boxes and numbers are what people like, or well, not what people, but what the system likes. So what have you kind of found in that respect?
I don't know, should I take this one or you, Kira?
Take it, Dylan, that's fine. Yeah.
So with the Lalela project in particular, we were just getting going with accessing into the kind of national policy space. So we actually haven't had an opportunity yet to be with policymakers for this project, but I could speak to other projects like Ulwandle, which looked at street level drug addiction. We were able to, you know, both local policy within a municipality, we were able to make some explorative changes around like new pilots processes to respond, new rethinking of some of the policing training. And then we were also able to go into we got invited twice to the national policy discussion on harm reduction and drug policy. And we were able to perform the play as an alternative to kind of offering a report. What's happening now, which is interesting in the One Ocean Hub, is that we've got these researchers, particularly marine scientists, seem to have the ear of the high policy space because of the long work that they've done to build those relationships around building marine spatial plans. I mean, marine protected areas. We've just had this massive expansion of marine protected areas in South Africa, which is a huge win for biodiversity, huge loss for communities in many cases. So we now have this very awkward situation. We're working with it quite carefully. But what it means is that we've got this new access, and it's actually taken some work, not from the play, or actually what the play allowed was for us to develop trust with some of the people who have the ear of policymakers. So we've got marine scientists who've often just thought about biodiversity, or sometimes even deep sea corals, for example, who's suddenly thinking about realizing that those deep sea corals actually have spiritual significance for people, and realizing actually that there is something that I should be working more with social scientists. And we had recently, it was 2 weeks ago, I think, there was a marine spatial planning consultation, national consultation, and we as marine social scientists could work with the marine scientists to kind of try both comment on the way in which marine spatial planning is expanding really fast here without proper consultation, but also there's a strategic move now to look at ways in which we can enter into that space, maybe join a technical working group and try to influence it from within there as representing social science. So at the moment, what the play has just done is build solidarity amongst the research network that has access to the policymakers. Our next big step, and what we'll be researching and exploring over the next 2 years, is what impact we can actually make in the policy space.
Okay, yeah, no, that's great. And I guess the role of champions within, that's really important. We have that here too, where we need to have those people working within our relevant authorities that are champions of the marine social sciences, for example, and want to make sure those conversations are being had. So it's great that the play has facilitated the building of those relationships. Yeah, and oh, go on.
I see Kira wanted to add to that.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Kira. Yeah.
Oh yes, no thanks. I just wanted to say the other interesting thing is that I think Dylan's right. The play has built a sort of new way of working between some of the scientists within the One Ocean Hub, at least the start of a different type of conversation, which has been really useful. It's done a similar thing with some of the environmental activist groups, especially with the fishers. So a lot of those organizations or associations saw the play, and that is a sort of, really built another type of relationship. So now we've written policy reports, for example, that have been commissioned by civil society organizations around the small scale policy. And then lastly, Dylan and I are going to start experimenting with some of our colleagues who are marine biologists and marine scientists around how you might take these very powerful forms of maps, which I know your country uses too for marine spatial plans, and how we might actually start to map different layers of data, like how you might map emotional connections, spiritual sites, histories of removals, etc., histories and current contemporary livelihoods, and what happens if you start to build a marine spatial plan in that language, which is very sort of dominating discourse, but with alternative variables.
Which would just be fantastic. I mean, I think there's a lot of conversation around now, really recognizing the importance of the emotional connections that different individuals and communities have with the ocean and coast and nature more broadly. And I think the COVID situation over the last 8-9 months has definitely brought some of that to those conversations as well. I've been involved in some work looking at ocean literacy and what that might mean in terms of kind of leading to behavior change, and that emotional side is definitely something we've wanted to kind of really highlight, that it's really important. Dom has a question around, Dom, I might not get this right, but reaching policies, the script one. She wanted to read more about the work around the research, the script as a policy brief. And is there an example on the website to help the audience see what that looks like and that data layer that they could see kind of examples of? I hope that's right, Dom.
Yes, yeah, there is an excerpt from the script, but we're going to be publishing a version of it, an online version of it soon, where you can actually see the policy brief. But one example that's been really successful is the Ulwandle example. So if she clicks on the other project, which isn't an oceans project, it's got to do with street level drug addiction, but that you can actually get the full script with the downloads, and you can with the footnotes, and then you can see how that was used. And there's quite a bit of information on how that process went.
Brilliant, that's great. Thank you so much. And obviously any links that you guys share with me, I can pop on the YouTube recording and send out through the MarSocSci newsletter as well. So Dom, we can get those to you in that way too. Just checking if there are any other questions. I've got loads of things I could ask you, but I probably shouldn't keep everybody for another hour while I'm talking about it. So we should probably arrange that at another time. But thank you all so much. I think we'll wind up since it's 2:05. But huge thanks to Dylan, Kira and Anna. The presentation was just absolutely fascinating. Really, really enjoyed it. And really look forward to seeing what else is to come through the project. For those of you that are listening and watching, we will have another MarSocSci webinar on the 3rd of December, and it's actually building on, it will be another presentation on this more kind of creative approaches. So Dominica Williamson, who just asked a question, will be presenting on some of the work around coral communities. So please do dial in for that as well. And yeah, just thank you all very, very much, and looking forward to seeing what else comes out of the project. And stay well and safe and enjoy your summer. Well, we're all in winter.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
very much, everyone. Thanks so much for having us.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.